Hi everyone. In this lecture, we are going to talk about study design. We have a whole module later in the course on research design, but we are just going to give an introduction here to provide a framework for the next few lectures. So what is the purpose of a study and how do we do it? Studies involve gathering data to see if variables are related or if hypotheses are correct. So here is generally the scientific method. First, we observe the world to try to come up with interesting questions that we want to answer. We formulate these questions. We develop a hypothesis, how we think these questions might be answered. We then collect data and run experiments to examine such a phenomenon. And we then conduct a statistical analysis to see what is the relationship between our variables. We then interpret these data and come to a conclusion based on our data. There are two different types of studies that we will talk about today, and those are experimental and observational. So observational studies, just like the name suggests, is when we observe behavior. We observe natural behavior. We don't change the behavior of our subjects, we just observe it. So this could include surveys. This is used in studies where we don't want to change something, we want to observe the natural behavior, or where implementing some new variable would be unethical. For example, if you wanted to study something in smokers and non-smokers, you would recruit people who already smoke rather than asking people to take up smoking just for the purpose of your study, because we know that smoking is bad for your health. Experimental studies. In an experimental study, researchers change a variable to test a hypothesis and look at the outcome of changing that variable. Subjects are often sorted into groups, at least two groups, maybe more, perhaps a test group and a control group, and the test group receives a treatment or an intervention and the control group does not. It is important that we keep every other variable the same as much as we can, so that if we do find a connection between variables, between the treatment and an outcome, that we can reasonably say that this is due to the treatment and not some outside factor. So an example of an experimental study could be, does altering a certain gene in mice lead to greater intelligence? Now I've got three examples and we're going to go through whether these are experimental or observational. And I'll pause for a few seconds after each one to give you a chance to think. First example, a researcher studies whether yoga decreases stress. They assign half of the participants to a yoga class and the other half to complete a puzzle and then measure their stress levels. Is this experimental or observational? And the answer that this one is experimental. We are not simply observing the natural behaviors of whether people attend yoga class or not. We are asking a certain group of people to attend a yoga class and a certain group of people to not attend a yoga class, and then looking at the outcome. Next example, a researcher goes to the park and asks dog owners and people without dogs about their levels of physical activity to see if dogs increase fitness. Experimental or observational? This one is observational. We are observing the natural behaviors. We are not asking people to buy a dog for the purpose of our study and then see what happens to their fitness. We are merely observing what exists in the natural world by observing and asking people about their behaviors and whether they have a dog or not. Last example, a researcher asks people the amount of sleep that they spend, the amount of time that they spend on the computer every day and the amount of sleep that they get to see if screen time decreases sleep quality. Experimental or observational? And this one is also observational. We're simply asking people how much time they spend on a computer. This could be experimental if we specify that a group of people should spend X amount of time on the computer and a certain group of people should spend a different amount of time on the computer, and then seeing what happens with their sleep. But just observing the natural behaviors of how much time people spend on the computer means that this is an observational study. Variables. We talk about variables a lot in our studies. It's a general term. A variable is something that can change, it can vary. In an experiment, researchers change one variable and attempt to keep all others the same so that they can observe the effect on another variable. The variables that the researchers change is called the independent variable, and the outcome is the dependent variable, because we are hypothesizing that its measurement, its behavior is dependent upon the independent variable. All other variables should remain the same between different tests. For example, a scientist wants to know whether taking melatonin will increase the amount of sleep that a person gets. In this case, the independent variable is whether melatonin was taken, while the amount of sleep is the dependent variable. Okay, a few examples here. In each of these cases, which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? How does cell phone usage affect mood? In this case, cell phone usage is the independent variable and mood is the dependent variable. How does ice cream lead to acne? Here, ice cream consumption would be the independent variable and acne would be the dependent variable. Is playing video games linked with obesity? Video games played, this could be yes, no, or maybe a continuous measure, meaning how many hours of video games somebody played. And the dependent variable would be BMI or some other measure of obesity. Are higher test scores a result of vitamin supplements? In this example, vitamin supplements are the independent variable and test scores are the dependent variable. And just a note here, the phrasing here is problematic. A result of, that is suggesting a causative relationship between two variables, when most of the time we deal with correlations. It's certainly possible to provide evidence for a causative relationship, but it is a lot harder and takes a lot more detailed data to do so. Mostly what we deal with is associations and correlations. So if we were simply asking if somebody takes vitamin supplements and then asking for their test scores, this would be answering the question, are higher test scores related to vitamin supplements? Next example, are residents of Oregon more likely to believe in Bigfoot? Here, the independent variable would be whether somebody is a resident of Oregon or not, and the dependent variable would be belief in Bigfoot. And lastly, is the number of Legos in a given household affected by the number of children? In this example, the independent variable would be the number of children in a household, and the dependent variable would be the number of Legos. Last piece about variables. Variables can be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative variables can be measured and have a number for an answer. So this could be hours, inches, pounds, number of correct answers, number of cars entering a parking lot per hour, for example. Qualitative variables describe characteristics and they have words for an answer. So this could be somebody's mood, the color of something, the shape of something, or their gender. And in this example here, it could be the models of cars in a parking lot. And for a lot of these qualitative variables, when we do statistics, we can imagine them as quantitative variables. So perhaps as gender instead of having it as male, female, because we can't, in our code, we can't necessarily analyze that. We could code it as a 0 and a 1, for example. But they are qualitative variables in how the different conditions of those variables relate. So a few examples here. Which of these are qualitative and which are quantitative? We have average cost of a gallon of milk at different stores, most popular brand of jeans, mood rating on a scale of 1 to 10, stress level, high, moderate, low, area code, level of education, and whether or not a person has seen Jurassic Park. The ones that are green are quantitative and the ones that are blue are qualitative as they're expressed here. So average cost of gallon of milk and mood rating on a scale of 1 to 10 are both quantitative variables. Some of these can be a bit complicated. So stress level and level of education, as they're written here, are qualitative, but they can be and are often analyzed as quantitative variables if they're expressed as numbers. Other factors besides the independent variable and the dependent variable should be controlled. So say, for example, you're testing whether a certain fertilizer makes a plant grow taller. What are the independent and dependent variables in this case? Your independent variable would be the different types of fertilizer used, and the dependent variable would be the height of the plant that grows. So what are other variables that could impact how tall a plant grows that you would want to control for? Well, this could be the amount of light that the plant receives, the temperature of the room, the type of plant, and the amount of water. These are all things that you would want to keep constant between the different conditions being different types of fertilizer being used. And that way you would know that any difference you see in height is more likely due to differences in fertilizer as opposed to other outside factors that could confound this relationship. And lastly, good data and bad data. So let's say you want to, there are good ways and bad ways to collect information. And generally, we're always trying to get data that are most representative of the population that we're trying to study. So let's say that you want to know what people think of emo music. You want to know what the general population thinks about emo music. So you stand outside of your local Hot Topic at the mall, if a physical mall still exists near you, and you ask people their opinion on music. Why might your data be skewed, and how could you eliminate bias? Well, your data might be skewed because people who enjoy emo music might be more likely to shop at Hot Topic than the general population. And so if you're only asking people who are already more likely to enjoy this type of music, you're not necessarily going to get an answer that's representative of the general population. How could you eliminate bias? You could do this as a phone interview instead, or an email. If you wanted to do this in person, you could walk around the mall and stand outside of different stores instead of just standing outside of one. And lastly, and we're going to go into more detail on this in the next lecture, another example of things that we need to consider when we want to know if we have good data or bad data. Let's say that you developed a drug that can cure the common cold, and you decide to test it with a study. You recruit 100 people who have colds, and you give half of them the drug. You then compare the symptoms of the people who got the drug, the trial group, and the people who did not get the drug, the control group. So if people who received the drug report fewer symptoms, can you be really excited that you found something significant? Maybe, but it could also be because people believe that the drug is working. This is called the placebo effect, and we're going to talk about it more in the next lecture, where just the act of participating in a study can change people's behaviors, and people's expectations can also change outcomes. If somebody really believes that something is going to work, it might be more likely to work for them. So fun example is just Dumbo and the feather. It only works when Dumbo believes in it.